Imagine a modern jet, a Boeing 777. One of the workhorses of long-haul travel just vanishing right after takeoff.
Yeah, no wreckage found for ages. Families just left hanging. It's been, what, 11 years now?
11 years since Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 MH370 disappeared back in 2014. It's still such a baffling mystery.
Absolutely. And it's generated so many questions, so many theories.
Which is exactly what we're diving into today. We're going to unpack the major conspiracy theories swirling around MH370.
And we've got some interesting sources to work with. News reports covering the search, the family's ordeal.
Right, and also a pretty active Reddit thread with technical deep dives and, well, some wilder ideas.
Definitely. Plus an academic paper on the psychology behind why we latch onto these kinds of theories, and some analysis of social media chatter.
Our goal here is really to break down these complex, sometimes contradictory ideas step by step. Assume you know nothing coming in.
We'll explain it all, because the core mystery is just staggering. A state-of-the-art plane gone, huge search, still no definitive answer.
And behind all the tech and theories, real people, real families, still desperate for closure. So where do we start? The rogue pilot theory seems like the obvious one.
It's definitely one of the most persistent. It focuses on the captain, Zaharia Ahmad Shah, suggesting he intentionally flew the plane off course.
What's the basis for that? What evidence points that way?
Well, the most cited piece of evidence is his home flight simulator. Investigators found a flight path saved on it
Ah, yeah, I remember hearing about this.
that closely matched the projected route the plane is thought to have taken, way out over the remote Indian Ocean.
So, like, practicing it beforehand?
Kind of. It's a bit like practicing a really tricky maneuver in a game before you try it for real. The simulator data showed he could have flown that route. It was possible.
Okay, possibility. But practically speaking, how does a pilot just seize control like that? Especially now, post 9/11, with all the cockpit security.
That's a really good question. Cockpit doors are heavily reinforced now, and they lock from the inside. Plus, there's usually a camera, so pilots can see who's outside. So, for this theory to hold water, the co-pilot would probably have had to leave the cockpit first.
For what? Like a bathroom break?
Yeah, or maybe the captain asked him to check something in the cabin. Once the co-pilot's out, the pilot inside can lock that reinforced door, and then they have sole control. That's standard procedure now.
Okay, so that's the how potentially covered. But the huge question is, why? What reasons are ever suggested for Captain Shah doing something so catastrophic?
Well, that's where it gets murky. Several motives have been floated, some more grounded, some quite speculative.
Like what?
There was talk, I think it surfaced in a Reddit comment that got deleted later, about a political connection.
Political.
Yeah, alleging the pilot supported an opposition leader in Malaysia who, coincidentally, was charged with a crime on the very day MH370 vanished.
Wow. So the idea was, what, protest?
Maybe some kind of protest or even a desperate negotiation attempt that went horribly wrong and then maybe got covered up. It's very thin, though.
Sounds incredibly dramatic, almost cinematic. Are there other suggested motives?
Yes, and tragically, the idea of murder-suicide is probably the most prominent theory linked to the pilot.
That was pushed quite hard in some media, wasn't it?
It was. A New York Magazine piece really highlighted that simulated flight path as potential evidence of intent to crash the plane, killing everyone on board.
But didn't the official investigation pour cold water on that?
Pretty much. The official Malaysian report said they found no signs of psychological distress or any red flags with either pilot that would suggest they were capable of that.
And the Australians, the ATSB.
They acknowledged the simulator data, yeah, but they were careful. They stressed it only showed it was possible he planned that route, not that he actually did it on the flight. Big difference.
Right. Distinction between capability and action. Someone on Reddit asked a really good question about the political motive.
Oh, yeah.
If it was a political statement, why not use the radio? Why not broadcast his demands or his message? Just flying off silently seems counterproductive.
That's a very strong point. The lack of any communication definitely undermines the political statement idea. You'd expect some kind of declaration.
So what else is there, if not the pilot acting deliberately?
Well, interestingly, that same Reddit thread also floated a much less sinister idea. Maybe a massive electronic failure.
Like the systems just died?
Sort of. The theory goes that maybe navigation and communication systems failed suddenly. The pilot tries to turn back to Malaysia, but without nav aids, he misses it in the dark, flies past, and just keeps going over the Indian Ocean until...
The fuel runs out.
Exactly. A catastrophic accident, but an accident nonetheless.
Okay, that sounds simpler, maybe more plausible than complex plots. But wasn't there an issue with the timing?
Ah, yes. Another Redditor jumped on that straight away. The supposed failure happened just as the plane was leaving Malaysian airspace and entering Vietnamese control.
That feels like a huge coincidence, like too convenient.
It certainly does raise eyebrows. Why would a random failure happen at that exact moment, at that specific geographical boundary? It makes you wonder.
Yeah, it really does. And there was also some Reddit chat about if a crash was inevitable, maybe the pilot aimed for the most remote spot possible.
Yeah, speculation that if he knew it was futile, maybe running out of fuel, he might have tried to ditch it where it would cause the least harm on the ground. A grim thought, but possible.
It is grim. But going back to the suicide idea for just a second, someone else on Reddit pointed out that pilot suicides, historically, tend to be quick. A sudden dive.
Right, not usually flying for 6 or 7 hours first.
Exactly. Why fly for hours across an ocean if the intent is immediate destruction? It doesn't quite fit the pattern, does it?
It really doesn't. That extended flight time is a major hurdle for the simple pilot suicide narrative, which naturally leads people to wonder about other possibilities, maybe involving the passengers.
Ah, the passenger hijacking theories.
Yeah.
But again, post 9/11, how likely is that? Like that Reddit user asked, wouldn't the crew have sent some kind of signal?
It seems incredibly difficult, you're right. We talked about the reinforced locking cockpit door, the camera. For passengers to take control would likely mean a catastrophic security breach before boarding, which there's no evidence for, or just overwhelming force in the cabin that somehow stopped the crew using alarms or phones. It's a very high bar.
So if we entertain the idea for a moment,
Yeah.
what would the why be? Why would passengers hijack a plane?
Well, one idea mentioned on Reddit was asylum seekers. Maybe a group trying to force the plane to fly to Australia.
But that's pure speculation.
Bare speculation, zero evidence, just an idea thrown out there.
Okay. What about those two Iranians traveling on stolen passports? That was big news initially.
It was, and they were looked at very closely, very quickly. But they were ruled out pretty fast.
Why?
The assessment was they were likely just asylum seekers trying to get to Europe, using stolen passports as a means to travel. Interpol specifically said they didn't think it was terrorism related.
Right, so that lead went cold. But Reddit being Reddit, there were darker theories too. Something about the Russian GRU. Military intelligence.
Oh yeah, that one pops up. The idea that Russian operatives somehow hijacked the plane electronically or were involved sounds like a spy thriller.
It really does. But why? What's the supposed motive there?
That's usually where the theory gets fuzzy. Geopolitics, some secret objective. It's never really clearly articulated.
And someone on Reddit poked a hole in that too, didn't they? About the satellite system.
Exactly. A very smart point. If the Russians, or anyone, were sophisticated enough to disable all the main communications and take remote control, why leave the Inmarsat satellite ping system partially active?
Yeah, why let it keep sending those signals that later help track the plane's approximate path?
Right, and why send potentially confusing data instead of just making it vanish completely off all systems? It adds layers of complexity without a clear reason. It makes that theory seem less likely to many analysts.
Okay, so that one feels a bit far-fetched. What about the suspicious cargo theory? I saw that mentioned, linked to a French journalist.
Yes, that came up in the Reddit discussions too, often connected to that journalist and a Netflix documentary. The basic idea is that some entity, maybe the U.S. military, wanted to intercept some kind of valuable or dangerous cargo on board.
Intercepted by diverting the whole plane.
That's the implication. But the big question, the why, is missing. What was this supposedly suspicious cargo? The sources we looked at just don't specify. It's a bit of a blank.
Which seems like a pretty big flaw in the theory. A Reddit user also asked, wouldn't cargo get scanned? You can't just sneak anything onto a plane.
Exactly. Standard procedure involves cargo screening. So a theory based on totally unknown, unverified, suspicious items faces a high credibility hurdle.
But someone else on Reddit mentioned something about fiery images or debris in the South China Sea, near where it first vanished.
Yeah, that's an interesting point they raised. There were some early reports, even satellite images, apparently showing burning slicks or possible debris in the South China Sea, much closer to the last known radar contact point.
But the main search was focused way down south, in the Indian Ocean.
Precisely. Based on that Inmarsat satellite data we mentioned. So this user was highlighting the discrepancy, why focus entirely on the Indian Ocean if there were these potential signs much earlier, much closer to the original flight path.
That does seem odd. It highlights how confusing the initial information was, doesn't it?
It really does. And those kinds of inconsistencies are exactly what keeps alternative theories alive. The Indian Ocean search was driven by complex analysis of those satellite pings, which we should probably get into.
Okay, but before the pings, let's tackle that huge basic question. Why no phone calls?
Ah,
6 hours, maybe more, the plane was supposedly flying. Why didn't anyone call or text?
that is maybe the most haunting question for many people. In our hyper-connected world, total silence seems impossible.
So what are the explanations?
Well, one Reddit user, seemingly knowledgeable about the plane's setup, pointed out that MH370 didn't have passenger Wi-Fi or SMS capability through its entertainment system.
Okay, so no tweeting or texting from the seats. That makes sense. But the crew, they must have had communication methods.
They did. There was a satellite phone mounted on the wall in the cabin for the crew to use.
And they didn't use it.
Nope. Complete silence from the crew phone, too, which is highly suspicious. If you think back to 911, flight attendants managed to make calls. The silence here suggests either something happened very suddenly that incapacitated everyone, or the systems were deliberately disabled.
Okay, so if passenger phones were limited and crew phones were silent, how do we explain the lack of any signal from anyone? Reddit had ideas.
Several possibilities were discussed. One is simply the time of the flight. It was a red-eye. Many passengers would have been asleep.
Plausible. What else?
The hypoxia theory. The idea that the plane climbed rapidly, maybe intentionally or due to a system failure, to an altitude where the air is too thin.
Lack of oxygen.
Exactly. Leading to confusion, unconsciousness, death. Like climbing Mount Everest too fast without oxygen, people might not have even realized what was happening before they passed out.
That's a chilling thought. And it connects back to the pilot suicide idea, too, potentially.
It could. If that theory were true, passengers might have been incapacitated long before the plane flew over any areas where a cell phone might, just might, have gotten a signal.
And what about decompression? Like a hole in the plane?
That was speculated on Reddit, too. Rapid decompression. Oxygen masks drop, but maybe people couldn't get them on fast enough. You know how they say in the safety briefing, put your own mask on first?
Yeah, because you only have seconds.
Right. If panic set in or people fumbled, they could lose consciousness very quickly, preventing any calls.
Okay, but I remember reading that some families said the phones rang when they tried calling after it disappeared. What's that about?
That detail did circulate, yeah.
Mm.
But as someone clarified on Reddit, a phone seeming to ring on the caller's end doesn't always mean the phone on the plane is actually receiving the call and ringing.
How so?
The network might just play a ringing tone while it's still trying and failing to locate the phone. It gives the impression it's connecting, but it might not be.
So it doesn't necessarily mean the phones were on and working hours later.
Not necessarily. The only phone we know for sure did receive unanswered calls was that Inmarsat satellite phone in the cockpit.
Right, the Inmarsat connection.
Yeah.
That seems absolutely critical for understanding the later stages of the flight. Tell me about the power loss to the satellite data unit, the SDU.
Okay, so the SDU is basically the plane's modem for talking to the Inmarsat satellite. Sometime between about 1:87 a.m. and 2:03 a.m. local time, it seems to have lost power. We don't know exactly why.
And then it came back online.
Yes. At 2:25 a.m., just after the plane vanished from secondary radar, the SDU sent a logon request to the satellite. Think of it like your phone reconnecting to Wi-Fi after being turned off or losing signal.
What could cause it to need to log back on like that?
Usually it's triggered by a power interruption. Could be brief, could be longer. Or maybe a software glitch or failure in one of the systems feeding data to the SDU. Most investigators lean towards a temporary power loss being the most likely reason for that initial 2:25 a.m. logon.
And this is what allowed those pings later on.
Exactly. Even though regular communications weren't happening, the SDU and the satellite kept doing these hourly automated handshakes, these pings, confirming the SDU was still powered on and connected to the network.
And it's the timing and characteristics of those pings that allowed investigators to calculate those possible arcs across the Indian Ocean.
Precisely. By measuring the time it took for the signals to go back and forth, and considering the satellite's position, they could determine how far the plane likely was from the satellite at each ping. This generated those arcs, showing possible locations.
And that pointed towards the southern Indian Ocean.
Overwhelmingly, yes, especially the final pings.
Okay, so that explains the search area of focus. Now, the Australian investigators, the ATSB, initially favored that hypoxia theory we mentioned. How did that fit with the pings and the flight path?
Well, the ATSB looked at the lack of communication, the steady flight path implied by the pings, no sharp turns or erratic maneuvers, and those odd SDU logons. They felt an unresponsive crew due to a hypoxia scenario fit the available evidence.
Meaning the plane flew on autopilot for hours while everyone on board was unconscious.
That was their leading theory for a time, the plane essentially becoming a ghost flight until it ran out of fuel. But again, it's an interpretation, not definitive proof, and not everyone agrees.
Which brings us back around to that simpler theory from Reddit. Electronic failure, botched turnback, ran out of fuel. We talked about the weird timing. Any other issues with that one?
Besides the timing coincidence, which is a big one,
Well,
a complete catastrophic electronic failure might have been expected to be more permanent.
but the SDU came back online at 2:25 a.m.
Exactly. That suggests some power and functionality were restored, or never fully lost, so maybe not a total irreversible system meltdown. It leaves questions.
It's just layer upon layer of uncertainty, isn't it? We've got the rogue pilot, maybe passengers, suspicious cargo, technical failures. It feels like we need an explanation, any explanation.
And that's where the psychology comes in, right? That academic paper we looked at really digs into why these theories emerge and persist when official answers are missing.
Yeah, tell us about that. What drives people towards these sometimes elaborate conspiracy theories?
The paper highlights three main psychological drivers. First, what they call epistemic motives,
Epistemic, meaning
meaning related to knowledge and understanding. We have a basic human need to make sense of the world, to find certainty, especially when something shocking or confusing happens. MH370 left a huge void in understanding.
so conspiracy theories try to fill that void, like solving a puzzle, even if the solution is a bit out there.
Exactly. They offer a narrative, an explanation, where otherwise there's just baffling uncertainty. It gives a feeling of understanding, even if it's based on speculation.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second driver?
Existential motives.
Yeah.
These are about our need for safety, security, control. A plane vanishing feels random, threatening, makes us feel vulnerable.
And a conspiracy theory helps with that.
By providing a specific cause, often involving intentional human action, believing powerful hidden forces were responsible, even malevolent ones, can paradoxically feel more comforting than accepting random catastrophic system failure or inexplicable events. It imposes a kind of order, assigning agency rather than confronting chaos.
Right. Better the devil you know, maybe. Blaming someone feels less random. What's the third motive?
Social motives. These are about maintaining a positive image of ourselves and the groups we belong to.
How does a conspiracy theory do that?
Sometimes by blaming an outgroup or an external force, it protects the in-group. It can reinforce a shared identity, especially for people who feel alienated. The paper notes that online communities can form around these theories, providing a sense of belonging and shared reality.
That's fascinating. It explains why these ideas can become so ingrained in certain communities. The paper also said something about belief being more appealing than satisfying.
Yeah, it suggests that while these theories might scratch the itch for answers or control, they often don't lead to real closure. Because they rely on secrets and hidden plots, there's always more to uncover, more suspicion. It can be a rabbit hole that never really ends.
Like constantly chasing shadows. Okay, let's quickly touch on the social media aspect. How did platforms like Twitter or Facebook play into all this in places like China and Malaysia?
Well, the analysis showed social media was a huge hub for information and misinformation right after it happened. Both countries have massive social media usage.
But did people trust what they were reading there?
Interestingly, the surveys found a relatively low trust in social media news reliability in both China and Malaysia. People said they still preferred traditional news sources like TV and papers for accuracy.
That's a bit surprising, actually.
It is. But despite that skepticism, what people saw on social media still had an impact. Almost half the Chinese respondents and over a third of Malaysians said social media portrayal affected their willingness to fly with Malaysia Airlines later.
Wow. So even if you don't fully trust it, the narrative online still shapes perception and even behavior.
Absolutely. It shows the power of that public narrative. The study also mentioned that while the airline and government used social media, their communication wasn't always seen as effective in managing the crisis.
A tough job managing communication in a situation like that. Okay, finally, those news articles about the search difficulties and the mistrust, what do they highlight?
They really paint a picture of the family's agony and frustration, reports of heavy police presence at family meetings in Beijing.
Yeah.
It shows how tense things were.
And the criticism of the Malaysian authorities.
Yes, particularly about the initial reluctance to release military radar data. They called it too sensitive.
Which just fuels suspicion.
It does. Though a defense expert did point out that revealing your military radar's capabilities is a genuine national security concern, so there might have been valid reasons behind the caution, even if it looked bad publicly.
A clash between transparency and security.
Exactly. And that breeds mistrust. The articles also mentioned challenges with international cooperation, regional tensions, trust issues between countries hampering the search. Vietnam apparently scaled back its efforts, citing poor communication from Malaysia. China kept pushing for more transparency.
It sounds like a mess of miscommunication and suspicion on top of the tragedy itself.
Pretty much. The Chinese ambassador criticized Western media for rumors. A U.S. official reportedly criticized China for false leads, finger pointing all around. The lack of clear, trusted information early on created a vacuum.
A vacuum that all these theories rushed in to fill.
Precisely.
So after dissecting all this, the theories, the psych drivers, the communication failures, we're still left, 11 years on.
Still left with a profound, heartbreaking mystery. MH370's disappearance is unresolved. The families are still in limbo. The aviation world is still grappling with it.
We've walked through the main contenders. Rogue pilot, passenger actions, suspicious cargo, technical glitches like hypoxia or system failure, and we've seen why these narratives can take hold.
Yeah, and it really makes you think, doesn't it? When faced with such profound uncertainty, how do we cope? What does this whole saga tell us about our faith in technology, our trust in institutions, and just the raw power of stories when confronted by the utterly unknown?
That's a big question to ponder. It goes way beyond just this one flight.
It really does.
The MH370 mystery endures. A stark, unsettling reminder that even in our advanced world, some things remain deeply, frustratingly unknown.